Welcome to the IVF Journey with Dr. Michael Chapman, the podcast for couples who struggle with infertility and want to fulfill their dreams of becoming parents. In this podcast, you'll learn actionable strategies to deal with infertility from Dr. Michael Chapman, or Prof as he's affectionately known. Prof is the co-founder of IVF Australia and is a leading Australian infertility specialist who has helped over 3,000 couples realise their dreams of becoming parents. To access previous episodes packed with ideas, solutions and tips that actually work, head over to Dr. Chapman's IVF podcast on iTunes. You can also ask questions by contacting Dr. Chapman's rooms on 1800 111 483 or by emailing him michael.chapman@ivf.com.au.
That first cry of a baby born after the long journey of IVF remains one of the most beautiful experiences in the world. As an obstetrician and an IVF specialist, I've had the privilege of experiencing this over many thousands of times in my long career, but I still remain moved by each baby's first cry. It signifies the end of a long journey and the beginning of a new life. This is Professor Michael Chapman, co-founder of IVF Australia and host of the IVF Journey podcast. Thanks for tuning in. To access all the previous episodes, head over to my website, www.theivfjourney.com, and select IVF Journey Podcast from the navigation menu. You'll also be able to find the various services that we provide at IVF Australia. Today we're going to talk about miscarriage, which sadly can be the end of a journey we thought was going to be successful. Miscarriage after IVF is no more common than in naturally conceived pregnancies. The same problems occur in couples who need IVF as with couples who's pregnant without needing intervention. Miscarriage is predominantly caused by nature getting it wrong. When we analyse the chromosomes of the products of conception after miscarriage, 60 to 70% of miscarriages in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy are due to genetic abnormalities. Nature getting the number of chromosomes wrong is the commonest cause. And that seems to be the same whether a pregnancy is naturally conceived or conceived through ART. Miscarriage is related to age. The older you are, the more likely you are to have a miscarriage. The statistics are something like this. Up to the age of 30, 1 in every 6 pregnancies will end in miscarriage. By 40, that has risen to 1 in 4 pregnancies, and by 45, it's risen to 1 in 2 to 3 pregnancies. This is totally consistent with what we know about the genetic makeup of eggs and the subsequent embryos, which we are learning from the processes of genetic diagnosis that we're applying to early embryos before we put them back in the IVF programs. So these abnormalities occurring in the miscarriages are predominantly related to chromosomal abnormalities in eggs. And as I've said elsewhere in these podcasts, those aberrations of the genetic makeup are age-related. We know that more than half the eggs, even in a 30-year-old, are probably genetically inadequate, and that rises through the 30s into the 40s, so that the eggs resulting in pregnancies in a 40-year-old are much more likely to be chromosomally abnormal, and therefore, even if fertilization occurs, pregnancy occurs, implantation occurs, miscarriages are going to be more common because of those genetic abnormalities. The genetic abnormalities are random events. It's not that the parents, either the mother or the father, are carrying specific genetic abnormalities that will affect every pregnancy in the same way. That's incredibly rare. The vast majority are purely bad luck. At 1 in 6 chance of pregnancy being a miscarriage, it is a bit like rolling a dice. There are 6 sides to a dice. You roll the dice, you've got pregnant, you roll the dice, and 1 in 6 times you'll have a miscarriage. Even after 1 miscarriage, the dice still has 6 sides. And in fact, even up to 3 miscarriages, the chances of a miscarriage occurring are still only 1 in 6. That's hard to believe, but we've all rolled dice. We've all had 3 sixes in a row. That's what the odds are. Obviously, as you get older, in the late 30s and 40s, that the dice moves more to a 4-sided dice and the same concepts occur. Your odds are still 75% chance of that you'll have an ongoing pregnancy. So don't get too disillusioned by having had 1 miscarriage. So I spent a long time saying it's chance, and that's certainly the case with the first and second miscarriages. However, as the number of miscarriages rises, there is a likelihood that there's more to it than just random chromosome events. So the first tests that we do after a couple of miscarriages is to look at the genetics of the parents. People can appear quite normal and have some chromosomal aberrations that don't produce any problem in them, but may produce abnormalities in the eggs and the sperm. That one specific thing we go looking for is called a translocation. Either the male or the female may have their standard complement of 46 chromosomes, but on one arm of one set of the pair of chromosomes, a piece is missing. And when we go looking, we find that piece attached to another chromosome. It is translocated. What happens when an egg and a sperm are produced as they reach their final maturity is that each of those gametes receives one of the pair of chromosomes. And if it receives the pair with a deficient piece of chromosome, that embryo is doomed. Even if fertilization has occurred, that absence of a piece of genetic material will result in a miscarriage. So that immediately raises the risk of miscarriage from one pregnancy to another. It probably doesn't go above 50%, but it certainly does increase the risk to about 1 in 2 chance of a miscarriage. In that scenario, there are a couple of approaches. The old-fashioned approach was to use a donor. So you use donor sperm if the husband had a translocation, or the mother egg donation if the woman had a translocation. But today, with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, once we create embryos, we can then test them to check whether they have the deleted chromosome piece or whether they have the extra piece. The extra bits don't seem to make any difference. They will be normal embryos, and therefore reduce the chances of recurrent miscarriage by selecting only those embryos with a normal chromosome count. The next area we go looking is in the female. Obviously, the question is, once an embryo has been created and implanted, is there something in the mother that might be rejecting the embryo? Or is there a process going on in the mother that might result in the loss of the embryo? 2 specific areas that we look at. The first is whether the woman has an increased tendency towards blood clotting, because if that's the case, and there are some clinical syndromes where it is the case, miscarriage rates are high. It's thought because the tiny little blood vessels that supply the placenta in early pregnancy get clogged up with clot. Therefore, the placenta doesn't grow, the baby is not nourished, and therefore you have a miscarriage. So there are specific tests looking for what's called a thrombophilia. The next area we look at is immunology. This area is very unclear. and there are many tests that can be done. Most of them have not been proven in randomized controlled trials, nor have the treatments that they've been suggested. But we do know that there are specific clinical syndromes which involve immunological change, which increase the risk of miscarriage. One of those is called lupus, and we test for lupus as part of this screening of recurrent miscarriage. People looked at other immunological markers and in the hope of finding something. There is some evidence, for instance, that something called natural killer cells, if they're prevalent in higher numbers, may result in miscarriage, the pregnancy being rejected by the mother or the mother's immune system. Then there's the anatomy of the female. Is the uterus a normal shape? Does it have anything inside it that might interfere with implantation, scar tissue, or congenital abnormalities which result in fibrous bands within the uterus? That if a pregnancy comes to rest on one of those bands, the blood supply is not the same as the muscle of the uterus, and therefore nutrition will be restricted and miscarriage could occur. To check the anatomy, we can either do an ultrasound or an X-ray, or operatively we could even look inside the uterus with a tiny telescope called a hysteroscope and check that everything is normal. And finally, there's increasing evidence on the male side that they may contribute to miscarriages. Within the sperm head, there are all the chromosomes, the 23 chromosomes that will ultimately lead to the production of an embryo with 46 chromosomes. The integrity of that sperm, that genetic material, the chromosomes, the DNA, are important in establishing pregnancy to start with, but appear to be important in avoiding miscarriage. If there is fragmentation of the DNA within the sperm head, miscarriage rates have been shown to be significantly higher. And improving that DNA fragmentation has resulted in improved pregnancy rates and, more importantly, reduced miscarriage rates. So what we can do is, on a sperm sample, we can run it through a machine that measures DNA fragmentation. It's quite a sophisticated test, but it does tell us a bit more about DNA fragmentation and may give us a hint as to why miscarriages are occurring. So overall, the outlook after one miscarriage is extremely good. The odds are in the favour of a normal pregnancy in the next conception. 85% of couples who've had one miscarriage will have a normal baby in the next pregnancy. And even after 2 pregnancies, that remains the number, that positive number of 85%. By 3 pregnancies, it drops slightly, probably to more like 75%. We generally investigate patients very soon after they've had 3 miscarriages, and these days even after 2 miscarriages, because to find one of those rare causes that I've talked about obviously may change the game in terms of treatment and also one's ideas about the possibility of a good pregnancy from that point on. For couples who've been through miscarriage, it is incredibly traumatic. Pregnancies today, every one of them is a wanted pregnancy. People have stopped contraception to have a baby. So to have a miscarriage after apparent success is a devastating experience. The doctors caring for these patients must appreciate this psychological burden that comes with a miscarriage. And dealing with those patients is one of the more challenging parts of my daily clinical life. But I am optimistic, and they should be optimistic, that a normal pregnancy will occur in due course. And don't forget that you can access all the previous episodes by going to our website www.theivfjourney.com and select IVF Journey Podcast from the navigation menu.
Thank you for listening to the IVF Journey with Dr. Michael Chapman, the podcast which helps couples negotiate their way through the IVF journey, all the way to parenthood. You can also ask questions by contacting Dr. Chapman's rooms on 1800 111 483 or by emailing him michael.chapman@ivf.com.au.